Thanks, everyone. I'll just sort of introduce our lab a little bit and maybe pull back to the global green industrial policy picture and sort of situate the IRA perhaps not as the first or the greatest industrial policy, as Janet Yellen may have said, but as perhaps just a late entrant into the game. The US did try to have industrial policy being passed in earlier legislation, but this was only passed actually fully in 2022. So I'm at the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab with Bentley Allen, and we basically think the energy transition is geopolitical, and it's going to require a lot of action-oriented research to integrate all of the fantastic research that you guys have done, but actually bring it to governments, to policymakers in a very real-time way, because this is a very rapidly moving energy transition, and the geopolitical dynamics have changed very dramatically in the last few years. So just to situate the rise of global green industrial policy, I really think it begins in the mid-1990s. You can go back to China's moves towards wind, solar, and batteries right back then. And then in the early 2000s, you've had German policy, UK's wind policy in the 2010s, Korean pushes on batteries, the Korean Green New Deal actually in 2020, Japan's hydrogen policy. So we've had now, over 2.5, 3 decades of industrial policy, before the IRA. The IRA is very much a late entrant, and you can see that in just how rapidly the Chinese energy transition has led to collapsing prices that we saw yesterday from Danny Roderick. So whether you look at solar, EVs, or batteries, we are on very, very fast S-curves or early exponential curves that are going to plateau out perhaps later. But what we really find is incumbents have been dramatically underestimating the speed of change, and particularly in solar. So on the right here, you have the explosive sort of growth of solar. You can look at the numbers from Pakistan and South Africa, particularly in the last couple of years, easily adding 10% of their total power capacity just in a single year alone after sort of terrible energy shortages and load shedding. So this is leading to a strong contest between two competing political economies in many countries, one anchored on the old fossil order and one anchored on the new green order. So and I think the IRA is essentially a compromise between these two orders, the fossil political economy and the green political economy. The IRA is definitely working, as we have seen in previous slides and yesterday. It's boosting American manufacturing in solar, battery manufacturing, wind, hydrogen, CCS, et cetera. And as I said, it is playing catch up to Chinese policy, which is not standing still, but racing ahead. As you can see in these figures, it's grown up by a factor of 50 in just the last 10 years, with a huge surge from 2020, 2021 onwards, as Chinese credit policy moves away credit from the real estate sector into the new industries. And so the US response has been, very classic Hamiltonian sort of a response. Let's do catch-up growth, and let's use the classic tools of developmentalist state policy to try and catch up. And the means, the means that we've chosen is bottomless mimosas. And bottomless mimosas are, you go to the Treasury bar. Congress has decided to make almost all of these tax credits fully uncapped, barring a few exceptions. And so the Treasury will just keep giving you public money as long as you show up and satisfy the conditions that, Hassan is going to, tell you whether or not you're satisfying the conditions. And if you do, you get the bottomless mimosas. And, and this too is sort of a compromise between fiscal hawks in the US Congress, who essentially wanted a fully paid for bill that was paid for on the tax revenue-raising side. And so one of the compromises, was basically it's hard to estimate how many of these tax credits are going to go out of the door because it's entirely dependent upon uptake. And so, you look at a series of estimates, and all of them say that the official number of around $370 billion of an outlay from the Treasury over the next decade could easily be underestimated by a factor of 2, 3, 4, again, depending upon uptake, which is a function of democracy, state capacity, consumers, etc. And then the structure of the tax credits are manufacturing, then energy, then industrial. Is a very hands-on industrial policy. And you can all of these technologies are sort of specified in the bill, and that just sort of goes back to sort of Danny Roderick's point yesterday, that they are explicitly trying to shape the productive structure of the entire material base of this economy. And the United States has been sort of trying to do nearshoring, friendshoring. It's creating a massive demand pull for components from all over the world that are coming to the US and are being finished here. So solar and battery components are coming from all over the place. And one of the most important sort of ways in which this is a very activist sort of a policy is the battery tax credit, which was of $7,500, is broken up into two components. One half of it is the critical mineral tax credit. The other half of it is the battery component, $3,750. And essentially, both of these require more Make in America over time. Not all at once, but over time, knowing that we do not have the current mineral processing capability to have onshore minerals. So over time, we are going to be stepping up the domestic components. And then there's a second element, which is the sort of the foreign entity of concern ruling, which is from 2024, we do not want to be getting minerals that have been processed or extracted by China, or there's a level of ownership of Chinese firms that is restricted. So the idea is essentially to stimulate a domestic and a friendshored build-out of this EV supply chain, stretching from mines to the factory floor. Well, where are we going to get the metals from? There have been deals that have been struck with Canada and Australia that are now eligible for the Defense Production Act, which basically means American taxpayer money can go to purchase offtake contracts from Australia and from Canadian miners, because not all of these metals can be made in the United States. So we are sort of supporting the White House on sort of conversations and collaborations about exactly these sort of clean energy sort of supply chain collaborations. And I really encourage everyone to check out the IEA's report on the energy technology perspectives, which we also worked on. And it's absolutely a brilliant 500-page, like reams and reams of data from every single clean energy manufacturing firm across dozens and dozens of countries. And as you'd notice in this, most of the clean energy manufacturing capacity in the world is exactly in Factory East Asia, Factory North America, and Factory Europe. And very, very little of it is elsewhere. So the gray bar there is the manufacturing capacity that is outside of the core. So that essentially tells you that we are. This looks very much like a colonial order where raw materials are brought out from developing countries and processed in either US, Europe, or East Asia. So UNCTAD has a very serious warning that this seems to be slipping into sort of traditional trade patterns of neocolonialism. And I think this is essentially the big challenge going forward, is how do you build overseas manufacturing capacity in third countries that are eager to join into this clean energy race and contribute to solving the climate problem, but are currently lacking either the finance or the market access or the technology tools. And so we've seen some of the bigger developing countries like Brazil, India, Kenya sort of work with the US government to sort of get some sort of support for their sort of strategic sectors. And then lastly, the other big challenge that we are sort of working on is the world order itself. The World Bank, the IMF, the WTO has spent decades suppressing industrial policy. And as the global north is embarking upon industrial policy experiments, the south is essentially in a very crushing debt crisis and is embarking on austerity policy that is really pushing people back and impeding health and education, privatizing many of the state apparatus that you would expect should carry out industrial policy. So this is actually a very large problem that we are also working with these institutions to try and lift some of these structural conditions that is making the world completely unsafe for developing countries to pursue industrial policy. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, now we have time for 10 minutes of Q&A. Maybe we can borrow 5 minutes from the break. What do you think? Let's take like 3 or 4 questions, and then we do like 1 round of answers, and then let's see. Let's start over here, and then move to Hassan, and to the man next to him, and then to Andrew.
Thank you all. A question for Anne. And I'm Andrew Reamer, George Washington University, and a fellow graduate student with Annalise Saxenian, who is the at the information program at University of California. It seems to me that an issue with industrial policy is the failure at the moment of policymakers and economists to think business strategy. That I learned to do industrial policy from a guy who went to worked for the Boston Consulting Group, and did 240 projects at the state and local level. The CHIPS Act and politicians think technocratically. So the idea is, I recommend a book called Fluke, which by Brian Klass, it just came out. It makes the distinction between convergence and contingency, so that the idea is to policies are aimed to some happy ending, like the CHIPS Act, but are not set up to address contingency, which business strategy does. You're supposed to scan the environment and respond to events that you were not expecting in a collaborative way. So if you just talk a bit about how we can get economists and policymakers to think more like business strategists in terms of how to create programs that are responding to contingent events, not a form of mechanical or technocratic engineering.
So Andrew, I'll just tell you right now, that's what we spend all of our time doing at the CHIPS program office, is literally thinking about contingencies on our investments. So we'll chat about that. But Tim, to your point on tax credits, in the CHIPS Act, we have actually given out $0 to date from Treasury, from the government account, but firms have already claimed the investment tax credit. So you guys should go look at that, and I think it's a very understudied tool because it reduces a lot of business uncertainty. They don't have to negotiate with the bureaucrat. They need to read IRS regulations and make sure their tax accountants are okay with them claiming the credit once it's finalized, which is, I think, a very important content. The question I had for the panelist, Sue et al., is this. You guys talk a lot about the politics of industrial transitions in the West. And it seems quite clear, if we looked at Danny's comments yesterday, that China has a loss of manufacturing jobs where they're willing to swallow job losses and major impacts to existing sectors without a big political debate, right? So a question I have is, how much of the conversation around ineffectiveness about industrial policy is that in the West we are forced to have stakeholder debates, and in other countries there is a national top-down strategy that simply says, we will dominate this sector. If you are not on the train, sorry. And then the follow-on question, which may be harder, is and how do Western governments then react to that reality, given that we cannot ignore these stakeholders in those debates?
Yeah, my question was for Sue. I thought that your comment about how to boost suppliers and connecting them to anchor firms was really interesting. But I'm curious if you think that as you think about rebuilding the machining and tooling and component manufacturing industry and creating a robust experimental system that can support all this manufacturing investment, does all of this need to be tied to an anchor firm? And what are some strategies to kind of support intermediate suppliers and manufacturers that don't necessarily involve anchors?
Thanks. Yeah, I have a quick question about the 4 Cs for Anne. I'm wondering whether you can imagine a successful industrial policy that does any or all of the following 4 things. Corrects government and/or network failures rather than market failures, consults labor rather than business, and here I'm thinking of some of the examples Sue alludes to, limits competition rather than promoting it. For example, Chalmers Johnson's discussion of rationalization cartels in Japan. And finally, has no sunset provisions. For example, the national labs, SBIR, MEP, or DARPA. Thanks.
Question that we're sneaking in if you're keeping it very short.
First is whether the scale of U.S. efforts, maybe Europe's, are up to the scale of that of China. Given the head start that China has had on EV, the number of engineers they have, the size of the market, is it plausible that with the little amount that we're spending, that it will change the geography? And if it looked like we were beginning to change the economic geography, why wouldn't we expect them to respond to maintain their advantage? So maybe all of this is a futile effort. It will be good for the green transition, but not for anybody thinking about this as grabbing jobs. The second question I had is a debate that you often hear in Europe, a little bit in the U.S., about national champions versus a competitive framework. And there are a lot of people in Europe who advocate the national champion. And I just wonder how you view that and what the evidence is. And the third is the view that you often hear that, U.S. innovates, China imitates, and EU regulates. And that Europe has excelled in that and stifles innovation. I think that's a wrong view, but I just wanted your view about how you respond to that kind of critique.
All right, so now we give it back to the panelists. Maybe we do it in the order of the presenters, and everybody has 1 or 2 minutes to. But
yeah,
make
1
it
or
quick.
2 minutes to answer all these amazing questions. Sure. Okay, I'll just pick up 2 strands. I think Hassan's point about, how do we think about democracy? I mean, it speaks to your questions as well, Joe. I mean, the way I think about this is that sort of as I was coming up, I, as a professor and as a citizen, I lived in this world of the end of history, of this sort of neoliberal fairy tale, right? That everything good just kind of moved together. And it turned out that, American interests and power were well articulated through the liberal international order. And so there wasn't a lot of tension being a citizen of the United States, pursuing these free market policies, because that actually did accrue a lot of power and wealth to my country. We're now in this different world. And I think it's fundamentally more challenging because the thing that neoliberalism had going for it was it legitimated itself, right? Because aggregate welfare, right, was this really compelling story about how actually these policies are good, right, for the entire democratic public. We're now at a point where, people have profoundly questioned whether that was ever true, right? And you can call it market failure of climate change. I would call it sort of broader societal failure, perhaps. And so we're at this moment where everything is becoming very messy and contested and ugly in many ways, right? And we see this in the United States. I live in Washington, D.C., right? What's going to happen next week? But I think that's actually the normal reality of politics. When I think about, centuries and centuries of sort of history of how things are governed and how markets are governed. And I think we have to sort of get off this idea that all good things will sort of flow nicely together, and realize that this is the new normal. This is the reality that we're in. And so, it's going to be messy. It's going to be tough. We're going to have things that, quote unquote, disadvantages us, vis-a-vis China in terms of not hopefully being an authoritarian regime in the United States, right? But I think that's all things that we just simply have to figure out how to navigate. And for me, I welcome the sort of increased visibility about these political choices, about how markets are structured, about the values, be it climate change or inequality or security. I actually welcome that, and I think we sort of have to embrace it and figure out how to go forward. And I'll stop there. I would love to talk about, maybe at the break we can talk more about the EU and innovation and Spotify. Okay.
Great. These are amazing questions. I guess I'll answer in terms of the electric vehicle industry. So I think, can the U.S. compete? And I think the answer is yes. And so we were talking last night about the BYD Seagull, which costs about $12,000 in Japan, in China, which I have driven. And I think we can compete with that if we have true prices. So just to make the BYD Seagull compatible with U.S. safety regulations, what consumers would demand in terms of sound deadening material, we're up to $25,000. If we think about the implicit subsidies from the labor suppression in the Seagull, from the carbon-intensive steel that's in the Seagull, then we're getting, I don't know what, 30. And Ford is saying they're going to have a $25,000 EV, in 2030. So, I think you still need a package of policies. And I guess I think the tariffs probably have to be a package of these policies. I also think, back to your point about stock buybacks, this is we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back because all of the subsidies have to then meet these insanely high corporate hurdle rates. So that's an issue, but I think we could compete. And then to Nikhil's question about suppliers, I think the advantage, maybe what I'm doing is reinforcing some of the existing structure, but it's a way of working with the existing structure to get certain market failures solved around certainty of investment. And you have these small suppliers that make one bet. The automakers, their customers, have some idea about what that is, much more idea, and it's a much more credible signal. And so thinking about that, and then one of the things we're also doing is creating institutions, and we could talk more about this small business investment company. The idea is to bring these companies together, the automakers together as strategic investors to actually think of themselves as a group sending signals to their suppliers.
Sorry, we're running a little bit out of time, so how much? Okay, good. Perfect. Like 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. So I thank you so much for the panel's comments. I'd love to get all of your slides if that's possible. Really great. Really interesting, you two. So let me start with a question about national champions. That's a great question because I am promoting competition. I think that if your local market is not big enough to achieve economies of scale. That's why being export-oriented is so incredibly important. So think about how well Airbus would have done if it didn't have Boeing as a competitor, right? And that's why it had to be outward-oriented. So I think you can incorporate competition and the need to exploit scale economies together when you think about the export orientation as being really critical. I think one of the reasons the U.S. managed to grow behind fairly high tariff barriers historically is because there was a lot of internal competition and a huge internal market. So it's a great question. I've thought a lot about it. Question about business. I mean, I am just so encouraged by Susan's description of how the IRA has really promoted business activity in the United States. That's great and great work. I'm really thrilled. So I do believe that actually a lot of what we're talking about here, and certainly a lot about what we teach in business schools, is about business taking the role. And I do believe, I hope that there is a move away from shareholder towards stakeholder capitalism. And that means business really leading the way, as it has been. And certainly in the United States, just look at all the companies in California, look at Tesla. As an example, that was a purely business proposition, although it did get significant support from the government at critical times. Last answer to the 4 Cs, I would take I'm looking at 400 years of experience with industrial policy, starting with Louis XIV, looking across countries, across academic, non-academic work. And I guess I really believe that those 4 components are important. And certainly consultation extends to labor. Absolutely. I'm the first person to promote labor as an important component of any successful industrial policy. I'll stop there.
I'll just take the last question, Joe's question of, is it actually too late to catch up with China? I think it really depends upon some of the sectors. For solar, certainly, it's too late. And that's because the costs of solar in the last 3 years have gone down from 30 cents to 10 cents. They're going to go down from 10 cents to 3 cents a watt by 2030. So it's a very, very dramatic story of Moore's Law style learning and process efficiencies by Chinese and Southeast Asian firms. So solar is going to be very, very hard, but what that really means is you get cheap solar, and you get to deploy cheap solar, and I don't think the Chinese are keen to weaponize solar exports and stop them or whatever. I think they're pretty, from what you can see, is a very, very rapid importing of Chinese solar by dozens and dozens of countries, and on wind and battery, it's definitely not too late, and that's why the US and European and North African battery policy has been relatively successful. And then on Hassan's question about sort of the certainty of these tax credits, and I think that's essentially why the IRA extended them out for 10 or 15 years, to provide that kind of certainty to business, because in the previous decade we had a lot of chop and change, start and stop, the tax credits were going down, and that was presumably why businesses were not so keen to invest. So I think that's pretty much the best feature of the IRA, and all of that is certainly threatened by repeal scenarios under a Republican trifecta or Republican administration. And yeah, I think that's it.
All right, then let's give another round of applause for our panelists.